Ships were exploding, and nobody knew why. Not damaged, not torpedoed, not hit by shells or bombs, just exploding. One moment, a cargo ship would be sailing peacefully through British coastal waters. The next moment, a massive detonation would rip through the hull below the waterline, breaking the ship's back, sending her to the bottom in minutes. No warning, no visible attack, no explanation. It was happening everywhere. Off the Thames estuary, near Liverpool, outside Portsmouth, in the English Channel. British merchant ships carrying vital food and supplies were being destroyed by something invisible. Destroyers, warships specifically designed to defend against submarines, were exploding in waters that had been swept for mines. Even ships anchored in harbors, supposedly safe behind boom defenses and patrol boats, were being torn apart by underwater explosions that came from nowhere. By late November 1939, Britain had a crisis that threatened everything. Winston Churchill, not yet Prime Minister but serving as First Lord of the Admiralty in charge of the Royal Navy, was watching his fleet disappear. Merchant ships, destroyers, minesweepers, all sinking in waters that should have been safe. And the terrifying part wasn't just the losses. It was that nobody understood what was killing them. The traditional naval mines that Britain knew how to deal with, contact mines that exploded when a ship physically struck them, could be swept. Minesweepers would drag cables through suspected areas, snagging the mine's mooring wires, cutting them loose so they'd float to the surface where they could be destroyed by gunfire. It was dangerous work, but it was understood. There were procedures, countermeasures, a way to fight back, but these new explosions weren't triggered by contact. Ships were being destroyed by something that detonated when they came near it, even without touching it. Something that couldn't be swept by traditional methods because there was nothing to snag, nothing to cut loose. An invisible trigger that detected ships passing overhead and killed them from below. Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic to a weapon they didn't understand. And if they couldn't figure out how it worked, and more importantly, how to defeat it, the island nation that depended on imports for survival would be starved into submission before the Wehrmacht ever landed a soldier on British soil. If this story of an invisible weapon that almost destroyed Britain is already gripping you, hit that subscribe button right now because this is a true story of scientific detective work that changed the course of World War II. Drop a comment on whether you'd heard of magnetic mines before this video. And keep watching because the mystery gets even more terrifying before the solution emerges. November 21st, 1939. Just after dawn. The English Channel between Harwich and Felixstowe. HMS Gipsy, a G-class destroyer, 350 tons, crew of 145 men, was on routine patrol. This was home waters, British-controlled seas. The kind of patrol that should have been routine, almost boring. Check for German submarines, escort merchant convoys, show the flag, return to port for refueling and crew rest. The waters had been swept for mines the previous day, standard procedure in high-traffic areas. The minesweepers had found nothing, reported the channel clear. HMS Gipsy's captain wasn't concerned about mine danger. His attention was on potential U-boat contacts and the constant vigilance required to keep his ship safe from torpedo attack. At 0740 hours, HMS Gipsy exploded, not from a torpedo. The lookouts had seen no torpedo wake, no periscope, no indication of submarine attack. The explosion came from directly beneath the ship, amidships, exactly where the hull was weakest. The blast was massive, far more powerful than a contact mine should have produced. The destroyer's back broke. Steel hull plates that were designed to withstand shellfire were torn apart like paper. Water flooded into the engine room and the forward compartment simultaneously. HMS Gipsy went down in less than 4 minutes. Of her crew of 145 men, 31 died in the explosion or drowned as the ship sank. The survivors, many injured, all shocked by the violence and speed of what had happened, were pulled from the freezing November waters by rescue boats that arrived too late to save the ship, but in time to save most of the crew. The captain, dripping wet, half-frozen, barely able to process what had just happened, gave his initial report to the rescue commander. "We hit a mine, but the waters were swept yesterday, and I've never seen a mine explosion like that. It was as if something detected us and detonated directly beneath the keel." He was exactly right. But understanding what that something was, and more importantly how to defeat it, would require an act of scientific desperation that was about to unfold. HMS Gipsy's loss was terrifying because it happened in swept waters that should have been safe. If you're starting to understand why this invisible weapon terrified the Royal Navy, hit that like button right now. Make sure you're subscribed because the solution to this mystery required both incredible luck and brilliant scientific work. Comment on what you think was causing these explosions, because the answer isn't what most people guess. The Admiralty's initial response was denial. Naval officers, trained in traditional warfare, experienced with known weapons and established tactics, didn't want to believe that a fundamentally new threat existed. The official explanation for HMS Gipsy's loss was that she'd hit an undiscovered contact mine that the minesweepers had missed. Unfortunate, but not mysterious. Just bad luck in a dangerous war, but the explosions continued. And they had a pattern that contact mines couldn't explain. Ships were being destroyed in waters that had been swept multiple times. Not once, multiple times. Minesweepers would clear an area, declare it safe, and then watch ships explode in that supposedly clear water days later. If these were contact mines that the sweepers had missed, why were they always in the same high-traffic areas? Why were they appearing in waters that had been thoroughly swept? More troubling, the explosions were happening to ships of different sizes and types. Big cargo vessels, small coastal freighters, naval destroyers, minesweepers themselves. There was no pattern based on ship size or type. It was as if the weapon couldn't distinguish between targets. It just killed whatever came near it. And most terrifying of all, some ships reported near misses. They'd feel a thud or hear a muffled explosion nearby, look around, see nothing, and continue sailing only to watch the ship behind them in the convoy explode from what appeared to be the same location. As if the weapon had tried to kill the first ship, failed, and successfully killed the second. This was unprecedented. Contact mines don't miss and then successfully attack the next target. They're passive weapons. They explode when struck or they don't. There's no second chance, no discrimination between targets. But these explosions were acting like they had a trigger that was activated by proximity, not contact. Like they were detecting something about the ships passing overhead. By mid-November 1939, the Admiralty's denial was crumbling under the weight of evidence. Whatever was destroying British ships wasn't a traditional weapon. It was something new, something the Germans had developed in secret, something that the Royal Navy had no countermeasure for. Winston Churchill, reviewing the loss reports at the Admiralty, understood the strategic implications immediately. Britain was an island. Every ton of food, every gallon of fuel, every piece of military equipment arrived by ship. If German mines could close Britain's ports, not by laying thousands of mines, which would be detected and swept, but by making it impossible to know which waters were safe, Britain would starve. The Royal Navy wouldn't need to be defeated in battle. It would simply become unable to operate because every harbor approach, every coastal route, every merchant convoy would be a potential death trap. Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. But in November 1939, the mine crisis was even more terrifying than the U-boat threat, because at least with U-boats you could fight back. You could detect submarines with ASDIC, sonar. You could drop depth charges. You had tactics and weapons that worked. But against these invisible mines, Britain had nothing. Britain was facing an existential threat from a weapon they didn't understand and couldn't fight. If you're feeling the terror that British commanders felt in November 1939, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. Share this video because this little-known crisis almost changed the outcome of W.E.Tsu. Comment on whether you think Britain could have survived if they hadn't solved this problem. Keep watching because the breakthrough is coming. but it required incredible luck. The breakthrough came on November 22, 1939, not through scientific research or naval intelligence. Through luck and German carelessness, a Luftwaffe. A 59 seaplane was flying low over the Thames estuary, near the coastal town of Shoeburyness, about 40 miles east of London. The aircraft was on a mine-laying mission, one of many such missions that German aircraft had been flying over British coastal waters since the war began. Standard procedure was to drop the mines by parachute into deep water, where they'd sink to the bottom and wait for British ships to pass overhead. But something went wrong with this particular drop. Maybe the pilot miscalculated altitude. Maybe the parachute deployed incorrectly. Maybe it was simple human error in a dangerous mission. Whatever the cause, when the mine separated from the aircraft and drifted down on its parachute, it didn't land in deep water. It landed on mudflats, in shallow water exposed by low tide. Visible, recoverable. The mine sat there on the mud, looking like a large cylinder with a parachute tangled around it. Local observers spotted it and immediately called military authorities. This wasn't the first time mines had been found on beaches or mudflats, but previous examples had exploded when demolition teams tried to approach them, triggered by some unknown mechanism that made them too dangerous to examine. But this mine, sitting exposed on the mudflats at Shoeburyness, represented an opportunity that British naval authorities couldn't pass up, if they could recover it intact, if they could examine it without triggering the detonation, if they could figure out how it worked. Then they'd understand what was killing British ships, and understanding the weapon was the first step toward defeating it. On November 23, 1939, 2 days after HMS Gipsy had exploded, while the Royal Navy was still reeling from that loss, a team of extraordinarily brave men approached the mine on the Shoeburyness mudflats. They weren't demolition experts. They were naval officers and technical specialists who understood that someone had to examine this weapon, and if it exploded while they were doing so, at least they'd die trying to save the fleet. The team was led by Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry, with assistance from Chief Petty Officer Baldwin. They approached the mine wearing no protective gear. There was no protective gear that would help if the mine detonated. They worked in the cold November mud, carefully examining the cylinder, looking for any obvious trigger mechanism that might explode if touched. The mine was massive. Nearly a ton of high explosive encased in a steel cylinder about 8 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. The parachute was still attached, tangled but intact, and as Ouvry and Baldwin carefully examined the exterior, they found something that revolutionized their understanding of the weapon. There was no contact horns, no protruding triggers that would explode if a ship struck the mine. In fact, there was nothing on the exterior that would detonate the mine through physical contact. Whatever triggered this weapon was inside the casing, something that detected ships without being touched by them. They were looking at a mine that killed through an invisible trigger. If this scientific detective story is fascinating you, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Share this video because the solution these men discovered changed naval warfare forever. Comment on how you think the mine detected ships, because the answer revolutionized everything about naval operations. Ouvry and Baldwin worked for 3 hours in the freezing mud, carefully disassembling the mine's exterior casing. Every turn of a bolt might trigger the detonation. Every movement of a component might close a circuit that would send them and a ton of high explosive into oblivion. But they continued because the alternative, allowing this weapon to remain a mystery, meant watching the Royal Navy die ship by ship. Finally, they got the casing open and saw the mechanism inside. And what they found explained everything. The ships exploding in swept waters. The inability of traditional minesweeping to clear these weapons. The pattern of detonations that seemed to detect different ships differently. The mine was triggered by magnetism, specifically by the magnetic field that every steel ship generates simply by existing. Earth's magnetic field induces magnetism in large steel objects, ships, bridges, buildings. A ship sailing through the water carries a magnetic signature around it. a distortion in the local magnetic field that announces the ship's or presence to anything capable of detecting it. The German magnetic mine contained a sophisticated sensor, a compass needle balanced on a delicate pivot, connected to a detonator circuit. When a ship's magnetic field passed over the mine on the sea floor, the compass needle would swing in response to the magnetic disturbance. This movement would close an electrical contact, sending current to the detonator, and boom! The mine would explode directly beneath the ship's keel where the hull was thinnest, and the explosion would do maximum damage. It was brilliant, diabolical, and it explained why traditional minesweeping didn't work. You couldn't snag a magnetic mine with a cable because it sat on the seafloor, not tethered by a cable like contact mines. You couldn't trigger it by dragging something over it because it wasn't triggered by physical contact. The only way to make it explode was to present it with a magnetic field strong enough to move the trigger mechanism. And every steel ship in the Royal Navy and Merchant Marine carried exactly that kind of magnetic field. Simply by being made of steel, by sailing through Earth's magnetic field, British ships were advertising their presence to these weapons and walking into their own deaths. Ouvry and Baldwin carefully documented the mechanism, photographed everything they could, and then, even more carefully than they disassembled it, they disarmed the mine by disconnecting the detonator from the power source. Then they transported it to HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's torpedo and mine warfare establishment in Portsmouth, where technical experts could examine it in detail. The mine arrived at HMS Vernon on November 24, 1939. Within hours, the Navy's best technical minds were studying the mechanism, understanding its principles, and beginning to ask the critical question, now that we know how it works, how do we defeat it? Understanding the weapon was the first step. Defeating it required a solution that seemed impossible, neutralizing the magnetic signature of thousands of steel ships. If you're hooked by this story of scientific problem-solving under extreme pressure, make absolutely sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button and share widely. Comment on whether you think it was possible to make steel ships invisible to magnetic mines. Keep watching because the solution came from an unexpected source, a Canadian chemistry professor who was about to revolutionize naval warfare. The obvious solution, building ships from non-magnetic materials, was impossible. Britain had thousands of steel ships. Rebuilding them with aluminum or wood would take years and resources that didn't exist. Even if it were possible, new ships being constructed couldn't be switched to non-magnetic materials without completely redesigning them. Steel was essential for structural strength, especially for military vessels that needed to withstand battle damage. So the solution had to work with existing ships. Somehow, they needed to eliminate or neutralize the magnetic field that steel ships generated. But how do you eliminate magnetism from something that's inherently magnetic simply by being made of steel? This is where an unlikely hero enters the story. Charles F. Goodeve was not a naval officer. He wasn't a weapons expert or a mine warfare specialist. He was a Canadian chemistry professor who'd been working as a civilian consultant for the Admiralty, initially on completely unrelated problems, involving explosives and propellants. Goodeve was brilliant, in the way that certain academics are brilliant, capable of seeing connections between seemingly unrelated fields, able to apply fundamental physics to practical problems, unafraid to suggest solutions that seemed impossible to people locked into traditional thinking. When the magnetic mine problem was described to him in late November 1939, his immediate response was, "The ships can't stop being magnetic. But we can generate a counter-magnetic field that cancels out their natural magnetism." The principle was sound. If a steel ship generated a magnetic field of a certain strength and polarity, you could wrap the ship in electrical cables carrying current that generated an exactly opposite magnetic field. The two fields, the ship's natural magnetism and the artificially generated counterfield, would cancel each other out. To a magnetic mine on the seafloor, the ship would appear magnetically neutral, invisible. The concept is called degaussing, named after the unit of magnetic field strength, the Gauss. And while the principle was understood theoretically, no one had ever attempted it on anything as large as a ship. The questions were enormous. How much current would you need? How many cables? How would you route them around a ship's complex structure? How would you power the system? How would you know it was working? Goodeve arrived at HMS Vernon in early January 1940 and immediately began experiments. He started small, test models, small boats, working out the mathematics and the practical engineering. But time was critical. Every day that passed meant more ships exploding, more sailors dying, more cargo lost. Britain needed a solution not in months, but in weeks. One professor versus a weapon that was destroying the Royal Navy. If this underdog story is compelling you, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Share this video with anyone who loves stories about scientific breakthroughs under pressure. Comment on whether you think one person's idea could really save an entire navy, because that's exactly what happened, and the scale of what Goodeve accomplished is absolutely stunning. Goodeve's initial experiments at HMS Vernon used a small vessel as a test platform. He wrapped copper cables around the ship's hull in specific patterns, calculated the current needed based on the ship's magnetic signature, measured using sensitive magnetometers, and then ran current through the cables from generators installed on the ship. The first test was promising but imperfect. The magnetic field was reduced but not eliminated. Goodeve adjusted the cable routing, increased the current, refined his calculations. The second test was better. The third test showed a 90% reduction in the ship's magnetic signature. By the fourth test, Goodeve had developed a system that made ships effectively invisible to magnetic mines. But there was a massive problem: time and scale. Wrapping permanent degaussing coils around every ship in the Royal Navy and Merchant Marine would take months, maybe years. The cables had to be carefully routed around the hull, secured, connected to power supplies, tested. Each ship would need to be taken out of service for days or weeks while the installation was completed. Britain didn't have that kind of time. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be protected. Goodeve's solution to this timing problem was characteristically brilliant and practical. Instead of permanent coils, he developed a process called wiping. Ships would pass slowly, at yield about 3 knots, through a special degaussing station where massive electrical coils mounted on the seafloor would generate powerful magnetic fields. These external fields would temporarily neutralize the ship's magnetic signature by altering the magnetic domains in the steel hull. The effect wasn't permanent. A wiped ship would gradually regain its magnetic signature over days or weeks, depending on where it sailed and how Earth's magnetic field affected it. But wiping was fast. A ship could pass through a degaussing station in under an hour and emerge magnetically neutralized. Then it could sail to its destination, complete its mission, and return for another wiping before the magnetic signature had recovered to dangerous levels. The first wiping station was operational in March 1940 at Portsmouth. Within weeks, additional stations opened at Liverpool, Glasgow, and other major ports. The system worked. Ships that had been wiped passed over magnetic mines without triggering them. The Germans didn't understand what had changed. Their mines simply stopped getting hits on British ships in the numbers they'd been achieving. By April 1940, Britain had treated thousands of vessels through wiping stations. By mid-1941, over 10,000 ships, both military and merchant, had been either wiped or fitted with permanent degaussing coils. The magnetic mine threat, which had nearly paralyzed the Royal Navy in late 1939, had been effectively neutralized. The Germans noticed something was wrong in April 1940, their mine-laying. Operations hadn't changed. Luftwaffe aircraft continued dropping magnetic mines in British coastal waters at the same rate as before, but the results were dramatically different. Ships that should have been exploding were sailing through mined waters unharmed. The weapon that had terrified the Royal Navy just months earlier was suddenly ineffective. German naval intelligence couldn't figure out what had changed. The mines themselves were working. Test detonations confirmed that. The trigger mechanisms were functioning correctly. The magnetic sensors were as sensitive as ever. But British ships were somehow sailing over the mines without triggering them, as if the vessels had become magnetically invisible. The Germans captured a British merchant ship in May 1940 and discovered cables wrapped around its hull, the permanent degaussing installation. German engineers examined the system, understood the principle immediately, and realized that Britain had solved the magnetic mine problem in record time. The Germans had expected years of ship losses before the British figured out the trigger mechanism and developed countermeasures. Instead, Britain had gone from crisis to solution in less than 5 months. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat force, wrote in his war diary that the British degaussing program was one of the most rapid and effective countermeasures of the war. Coming from an enemy commander, this was high praise and an acknowledgement that Germany had lost the magnetic mine advantage. But the loss of one weapon didn't end the Battle of the Atlantic. If anything, it shifted German strategy toward more conventional threats: U-boats, surface raiders, conventional contact mines, and air attacks. The magnetic mine crisis had been a terrifying interlude, but the broader struggle for control of the Atlantic shipping lanes continued with even greater intensity. And the casualty numbers tell a story that's even more sobering than the magnetic mine threat. From September 1939 through May 1940, the period covering the magnetic mine crisis and its resolution, German U-boats alone sank over 300 Allied ships. That's not including losses to magnetic mines, conventional mines, surface raiders, or air attacks. Just U-boats. Over 300 ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, equipment, everything Britain needed to survive and fight. The magnetic mine was just one threat among many in the Battle of the Atlantic. If you're realizing how precarious Britain's situation really was in 1940, hit that like button right now. Make sure you're subscribed because the full story of the Atlantic Battle reveals just how close Britain came to losing the war before America even entered it. Comment on whether you think Britain could have survived without solving the magnetic mine problem. Keep watching because the German response to degaussing was about to make the Atlantic even deadlier. The German response to British degaussing came in 2 forms: improved magnetic mines with more sensitive triggers that could detect even reduced magnetic signatures, and a massive expansion of the U-boat campaign that would eventually become the Wolfpack tactics that nearly starved Britain into submission. The improved magnetic mines appeared in late 1940 and early 1941. German engineers developed sensors that could detect fainter magnetic fields, requiring British ships to undergo more frequent wiping or carry higher current through their degaussing coils. This created an arms race, Germany developing more sensitive mines, Britain improving degaussing techniques. But critically, Britain had the industrial capacity and scientific expertise to stay ahead in this race. Every German improvement was met with a British counter-improvement. More dangerous was the evolution of U-boat tactics. By late 1940, after the fall of France gave Germany access to Atlantic ports that dramatically reduced U-boat transit time to hunting grounds, Admiral Dönitz had refined the coordinated attack system that would become known as Wolfpack tactics. Multiple U-boats would gather around a convoy, attack simultaneously from different angles, usually on the surface at night when they were faster and harder to detect, overwhelm the escorts, and disappear before concentrated counterattacks could destroy them. These tactics were devastatingly effective. The period from mid-1940 through 1942 would be called the Happy Time by U-boat crews, months when Allied shipping losses exceeded the rate at which new ships could be built. In 1941 alone, U-boats sank over 2 million tons of shipping. In 1942, over 6 million tons. Each ton represented food that wouldn't reach British civilians, fuel that wouldn't power British aircraft, ammunition that wouldn't fight German forces. Churchill's famous quote, that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war, referred to this sustained campaign, not just the magnetic mine crisis. The mines had been terrifying because they were mysterious and seemed unsolvable. But once solved, they became manageable. The U-boats were terrifying because even when Britain understood the threat, developed tactics to counter it, and fought back effectively, the losses continued. Month after month, year after year, an attritional battle that Britain absolutely had to win or face starvation and defeat. The Battle of the Atlantic wouldn't decisively turn in Britain's favor until 1943, when a combination of factors, more escort vessels, improved ASDIC sonar, airborne radar, long-range patrol aircraft covering the mid-Atlantic gap, breaking German naval codes, better tactics, and hunter-killer groups specifically tasked with hunting U-boats, finally shifted the casualty ratios in the Allies' favor. By late 1943, U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could build and crew replacements. But that victory came after years of desperate struggle, and it only became possible because Britain survived the crises of 1939 to 1940, including the magnetic mine threat that had nearly paralyzed the Royal Navy. If the degaussing solution hadn't been found, if Charles F. Goodeve and the teams at HMS Vernon hadn't solved the problem in months instead of years, Britain might not have lasted long enough to win the Atlantic battle. The magnetic mine was one crisis among many, but solving it quickly was essential to Britain's survival. If you're appreciating how interconnected WW's challenges were, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button and share this video. Comment on what other WW2 technological races you'd like us to cover. Keep watching because Charles F. Goodeve's story doesn't end with degaussing. His wartime innovation saved thousands more lives. Goodeve didn't stop with degaussing. His success in solving the magnetic mine problem earned him credibility and resources to tackle other technical challenges the Royal Navy faced. He was appointed to the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a wonderfully British name for what was essentially a skunkworks organization tasked with developing unconventional solutions to urgent problems. One of Goodeve's next projects addressed another crisis: German U-boats attacking on the surface at night. In darkness, U-boats were faster than submerged. Diesel engines could run on the surface, providing higher speed than battery-powered underwater running. Harder to detect, ASDIC worked poorly against surface targets, and could maneuver better than escorts loaded with depth. Charges, Goodeve's team developed a weapon system called Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that could launch 24 small, explosive projectiles in an oval pattern ahead of the attacking escort ship. Unlike depth charges that exploded at preset depths whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog projectiles were contact-fused. They only exploded if they hit the submarine, which meant that if you heard no explosion, you knew you'd missed and could immediately make another attack. If you heard explosions, you knew you'd hit and could assess damage. The system was simple, effective, and deadly. Hedgehog improved the submarine kill rate by over 50% compared to conventional depth charge attacks. It entered service in 1942 and remained in use through the end of the war, credited with sinking over 50 U-boats. Each U-boat sunk meant dozens of merchant ships that wouldn't be torpedoed, thousands of tons of cargo that would reach Britain safely. Goodeve also worked on degaussing systems for landing craft preparing for D-Day. German coastal mines used magnetic triggers, improved anti-aircraft weapons, and various other projects that never became famous but saved lives and contributed to eventual Allied victory. His approach was consistently practical rather than theoretical. Identify the problem that's killing people. Develop a solution that works with available resources. Implement it quickly. Measure results. Improve. After the war, Charles F. Goodeve was knighted, becoming Sir Charles Goodeve, OBE, Order of the British Empire. He returned to Canada and continued his scientific career, though his wartime work remained classified for years. When he died in 1980, obituaries focused on his chemistry career and industrial consulting. The general public had little awareness that this chemistry professor had developed the system that saved the Royal Navy from magnetic mines, or that his subsequent inventions had contributed to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Goodeve's story is one of the great examples of civilian experts solving military problems that professional soldiers couldn't crack. If you're inspired by this story of innovation under pressure, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this video widely because Goodeve deserves to be better known. Comment on what other unsung W2D heroes you think deserve recognition. The degaussing technology that Goodeve pioneered didn't disappear with W2's end. It evolved into systems that remain essential to modern naval operations. Every major warship in every navy today has sophisticated degaussing equipment designed to minimize magnetic signature, not just to avoid mines, but also to counter modern magnetic sensors that can detect submarines from aircraft or other vessels. The principles are the same as Goodeve's 1940 solution: generate countermagnetic fields that neutralize the ship's natural magnetism. But the technology is far more advanced. Modern systems use computer-controlled coils that automatically adjust their output based on continuous monitoring of the ship's magnetic signature. They can compensate for changes as the ship moves through different magnetic latitudes, as crew moves equipment around, as weapons are loaded or unloaded. Submarines particularly need degaussing because any magnetic signature makes them detectable by magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD, carried by patrol aircraft. A submarine that's acoustically quiet but magnetically loud can still be found and killed. Modern submarine degaussing is so sophisticated that it's classified. The exact techniques and effectiveness levels are military secrets because revealing them would help enemies develop better detection methods. Even civilian ships benefit from degaussing technology, though for different reasons than military vessels. Large steel ships can affect compasses on other vessels. They can interfere with sensitive magnetic measurements for scientific research. Degaussing systems help minimize these effects, making navigation safer and scientific work more accurate. The magnetic mine threat itself remains relevant. Naval mines are still used in conflicts around the world. Relatively cheap weapons that can close harbors, restrict naval movement, and threaten shipping. Modern mines are far more sophisticated than Goodeve-era German magnetic mines, using combinations of magnetic, acoustic, and pressure sensors to distinguish between different types of ships and avoid countermeasures. But the fundamental challenge remains the same: detecting them, avoiding them, and sweeping them when necessary. And the solution remains a descendant of Goodeve's work. Ships with sophisticated degaussing systems, minesweepers that generate magnetic fields to trigger mines at safe distances, and underwater robots that can locate and destroy mines without risking human crews. The technology Goodeve developed in 1940 is still protecting ships today, 85 years later. If you're appreciating how W2 innovations shaped modern military technology, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that like button, share widely, and comment on what other DOE technologies you'd like us to explore. Keep watching for the final section where we tie together why this story matters beyond just naval history. Why does the magnetic mine story matter today? Several reasons, each important in its own way. First, it's a reminder that technological surprise can fundamentally change warfare. Germany's magnetic mines weren't an incremental improvement over existing weapons. They were a revolutionary capability that temporarily paralyzed the world's most powerful navy. The lesson for modern military planners is clear. Don't assume your defenses work against weapons you haven't encountered yet. Prepare for surprises. Have the institutional flexibility to adapt quickly when surprises occur. Second, it demonstrates the importance of civilian scientific expertise in solving military problems. Goodeve wasn't a naval officer or weapons engineer. He was a chemistry professor who approached the magnetic mine problem with fresh eyes and fundamental physics principles. Military institutions, for all their expertise, can become locked into conventional thinking. Bringing in outside experts, people who don't know what can't be done, often produces breakthrough solutions. Third, it shows that the time from problem identification to solution implementation matters enormously. Britain went from discovering the magnetic trigger mechanism in November 1939 to having thousands of ships protected by April 1940. Less than 5 months. This wasn't because the solution was simple. It required inventing new techniques, building infrastructure and treating thousands of vessels. It was because Britain recognized the existential threat and mobilized resources accordingly. If the solution had taken a year instead of 5 months, how many additional ships would have been lost? How much closer would Britain have come to starvation? Would Britain have survived long enough to become the base for Allied operations that eventually liberated Europe? These are counterfactual questions we can't answer precisely, but the implication is clear. Rapid response to technological threats can be decisive. Fourth, it's an example of how arms races work in wartime. Germany developed magnetic mines. Britain developed degaussing. Germany improved mine sensors. Britain improved degaussing techniques. Each side adapted to the other's countermeasures, driving continuous innovation. This pattern, measure, countermeasure, countermeasure, remains fundamental to military technology development today. And finally, it's a story about individuals making a difference. Charles F. Goodeve was one person. He didn't command armies or make strategic decisions. He solved a technical problem. But that technical solution saved countless lives, kept Britain in the war, and contributed to eventual Allied victory. Individual expertise, applied at the right time to the right problem, can have strategic effects. These lessons about technological surprise, civilian expertise, rapid adaptation, and individual impact are as relevant today as they were in 1940. If this deep dive into a lesser-known W-tweet crisis has been valuable to you, make sure you're subscribed for more stories that reveal timeless lessons from history. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone interested in innovation under pressure, and drop your final thoughts in the comments. What's the most important takeaway from this story for you? Thank you for watching this exploration of the magnetic mine crisis and the degaussing solution that saved the Royal Navy. This story connects technological innovation, scientific problem-solving, strategic necessity, and individual brilliance in ways that shaped the outcome of 2022. Charles F. Goodeve deserves to be better known, and the magnetic mine threat deserves to be better understood as one of the critical challenges Britain faced in the war's early years. Check out our other videos for more deep dives into WDQ's technological battles. And remember, sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields. They're won in laboratories by people asking, "How does this work?" and "How do we defeat it?" See you in the next video.